Gravegrass barely stirred when Henry Clove topped the ridge. Sunrise threw long cedar shadows over Archer's cemetery. The air smelled of sage and stone. He came, as he always did, to speak a silence only his wife Ella seemed able to answer. But someone was already there. A woman knelt beside Ella's headstone. Coat too big, boots scuffed thin, hair the color of a dusty raven's wing. Her lips moved, soft, steady, as if reciting letters nobody else had received. Town called her Crazy Nora, a drifter who talked to ghosts and slept beneath the rail bridge. Henry had half believed the stories until he heard her voice flow around the stone that still bore his name. He stayed behind a cedar trunk, listening through morning hush. Nora spoke of river fog curling like ribbon, of pomegranate seeds counted instead of rosary beads, of dreams where coal dust painted lungs black but never tongues. Her voice trembled once, steadied, like a colt choosing to stand. She laid a single lupine on the mound, brushed fingers across worn marble, then rose. Henry stepped forward, boot scuff betraying him. She turned, eyes wide yet focused. No apology, no fear, just measured breath. He tipped his hat. "You knew her?" Nora's shoulders eased. "Not the way you did. She listens." A shy, almost smile. "Somebody ought to." Words failed him. He gestured downhill toward town, the one road everyone used but her. She shook her head, walking off across dry grass until mesquite swallowed the shape of her. Henry returned at dusk out of restless habit, lupine still fresh, water jug half empty, as if the grave itself had drunk. He fitted the jug's cork, thumb tracing Nora's faint fingerprints. A quiet bloom of curiosity rooted in his chest, an ember in ash. Next morning he found a tin spoon against the headstone, handle engraved with forget-me-nots. Along its curve, two initials, NT. He remembered townsfolk saying she kept silverware to feed spirits. He tucked the spoon in his coat and felt the heft of unasked questions. The town kept distance. At Tuttle's store, whispers cracked like dry twigs. He paid for coffee beans, ignored side glances. Sheriff Lantry leaned in. "That girl wanders nights, talks to herself, scares livestock. Best steer clear." Henry simply nodded, but pocketed sugar cubes Nora might drop into phantom cups. On the fourth dawn, he saw her again. Frost laced the weeds. She wore no gloves. She spoke of tin roofs rattling like tambourines, of reading clouds like scripture. Henry broke the hush. "Ella liked clouds." Nora touched the stone, as if confirming. "She said the big ones hold stories." She hesitated, then asked, voice threadbare, "May I stay a little?" He shrugged. "Sky's wide." He left to chop cedar branches for the winter stove. When he returned, she was gone, but a second lupine nestled beside the spoon. Night dropped cold. Henry found Nora beneath the water tower trestle, coat pulled tight, fireless. He placed sugar cubes on a flat rock. She stared, then tucked them into her pocket without thanks, but without refusal. Days turned. She appeared at the grave near dawn, departed before full light, leaving tokens. River stones, a feather blacker than dusk, one porcelain button cracked across the middle. Henry began answering in kind. Coffee in a battered tin cup, a slice of bread wrapped in waxed paper, a pair of knit gloves once meant for Ella, but never worn. He spoke little. She spoke only to the stone. Yet a rhythm grew. Sunrise, sharing soil, leaving gifts. Town gossip thickened. Widower caught in a madwoman's spell. Henry felt the weight but could not step away from the ridge. Something in Nora's ramblings, half prayer, half confession, kept Ella present in a way his silent morning never had. Then winter crept. One brittle dawn, Henry found Nora collapsed at Ella's headstone, forehead burning, breath jagged, snow flurried at the edge of sight. He lifted her, light as wood shavings, and carried her to the homestead cabin that still smelled faintly of lavender soap. He laid her on the settee, brewed willow bark tea, wrapped her feet in Ella's quilt. Fever raged 3 nights. He fed her spoonfuls of broth, held her shoulders when chills hit, whispered nonsense he'd once saved for a newborn that never drew breath. On the 4th night, fever broke. Nora woke to lantern glow and cedar smoke. She tried to rise. Henry gently pressed her back. Strength first. She studied the quilt. Blue squares, white stars, eyes glistening. Your wife's? He nodded. She'd rather it warm someone than hang folded. Nora slept again, this time without ghosts. Henry sat by the stove, spoon in hand, thumb tracing forget-me-nots, wondering how far kindness could carry across the distance between living and what comes after. Outside, snow began in earnest, blanketing tracks, muting the road. Inside, two strangers shared a silence no longer sharp. And on the ridge, wind swept fresh snow over two lupines, one spoon, and the grave of a woman who apparently still listened. Now to both of them. Nora slept 3 full days in Ella's quilt, while the storm barricaded every window with snow. Henry kept the stove fed, and the silence gentle. When she finally woke, lantern light painted her eyes amber bright and wary. She tried to sit. The room tilted. Easy, Henry said, voice as low as the log's slow crack. He offered broth in Ella's old china cup. Nora sipped, then studied the cabin. Rough beams, one rocker, his dead wife's sewing basket still on the shelf. Everything smelled of cedar and unspoken agreements. I talked too long to the cold, she murmured. Cold listens poor, Henry answered. She traced the cup's hairline crack. Couldn't stay under the trestle. Folks threw rocks. She didn't cry, only stated weather like a rail timetable. That night, Henry pulled the spare cot from the attic. Snow groaned on the roof. Coyotes yipped in the coulee but kept their distance. Nora dozed, fever gone, cheeks pink with new blood. Henry sat by the hearth, carving a sliver of pine into the shape of a lupin blossom. The knife rasped steady, he told Ella, quiet aloud, how a woman with river-deep eyes now borrowed the quilt. The rafters did not protest. Storm broke. February sun glittered ice hard. Nora insisted on helping. She shoveled drifts from the barn door, breathed white ropes in frozen air. She spoke little, but the lines around her mouth eased. Henry cleared the north fence. From the ridge, he saw town smoke curling, harmless for now. They rode the wagon to Archer's Crossing to trade hides for flour. Nora stayed outside the store, stroking the mare's nose. 2 boys whispered, "Ghost talker," flung a snowball that spattered her coat. She flinched but did not flee. Henry stepped between, stare cold enough to freeze spit midair. The boys melted away. Inside, Mrs. Tuttle pretended busy, yet when Henry paid, she slid a paper parcel across the counter, dried lavender and a spool of blue thread. For your guest, she said. Gossip could bruise, but kindness bled through cracks. On the ride home, Nora held the lavender as if scent itself kept ribs from rattling. At the graveside next dawn, she crumbled a sprig on Ella's stone. For the quilt's perfume, she whispered. March thaw came early. Calving started. Henry needed hands. Nora surprised him. She knew ropes, salves, the rhythm of a cow's breath when birth stalled. Word spread that crazy Nora gentled a breech calf while whistling a lullaby no one recognized. The sheriff tipped his hat next time they passed, confusion mingling with respect. Evenings they shared Ella's recipe book. Nora, finger-tracing faded ink, baked sourdough that filled the cabin with yeast and memory. Henry read seed catalogs aloud, planning a garden he had never dared plant alone. One night, by lamplight, Nora unfolded her satchel. Inside lay scraps of coal company script, each margin covered with her tight, slanted hand. Stories, hundreds, written to no one. Miners' canaries that survived explosions, riverboats that never found port, a violinist playing to drown dynamite blasts. She spread them on the table, edges overlapping like quilt blocks. You kept them safe, Henry said. No, Nora answered. They kept me. He spent hours mending tears with Mrs. Tuttle's blue thread. When finished, the stories looked less like scraps and more like chapters. Nora watched, eyes reflecting lamplight and something steadier than doubt. April wildflowers flared yellow on the ridge. Henry hitched the wagon for cemetery day, Ella's birthday. He expected to go alone. Nora climbed in beside him without question. At the plot, she laid new lupines fresh from creek bank mud. Then she did something she'd never dared. She spoke directly to Henry, not through the stone. I used to think I heard voices, she said, gaze on the engraved name. Turns out I was waiting for someone else who could hear quiet. Henry's reply caught in his throat. He knelt, set the carved pine lupin at the base of the headstone. Some silences are too heavy for one pair of shoulders. Wind bent the grass. In that hush, he reached for Nora's hand. She let their fingers twin, pulse meeting pulse. From the ridge, Archer's crossing bell echoed. No alarm, just noon call. Yet it sounded like a promise kept. The world still turning, but grief finally walking beside someone instead of dragging behind. They rode home under sky so blue it felt new polished. In the wagon bed, Nora's mended stories fluttered soft as doves. Henry thought of cedar rafters, of lavender and quilts, of a garden still to dig, and realized the cabin no longer smelled only of yesterday. It breathed of soil ready for seed. Late April turned soft as warmed butter. Henry tilled a square of ground just east of the porch, Nora walking beside with a bucket of damp seed potatoes. Each time the plow paused, she dropped 3 eyes, whispered some half-rhymed blessings she said kept blight away. By noon, the row backs lay neat, the soil smelling rich enough to eat with a spoon. Town curiosity could no longer sit quiet. One Sunday, the preacher rode out, tie flapping, dust foaming at his gelding's mouth. He asked polite whether Henry might reconsider harboring a woman whose mind wanders unchaperoned. Henry answered with coffee and silence. Silence won. The preacher departed, sermon unwritten, but gossip found harsher tongues. A trio of ranch hands from the Hatchet Bee spread a story that Nora stole grave rings at dusk. When Henry delivered beef to the co-op, he caught the tale mid-stride. He didn't swing, merely stared until the speaker looked away, throat working like a calf chewing thistle. Yet rumor traveled faster than wagons, straight to Nora's ears. That evening she sat on the porch rail, knees hugged to chest, eyes fixed on the ridge where headstones caught last light. "Folks think broken means dangerous," she said. Henry wiped plow grease from his fingers. "Folks measure wrong things." He lifted a jar of peach preserves. Ella's last batch, saved 5 years, set it between them. They ate with 2 spoons, straight from glass, the sweet thick enough to glue shut 1,000 careless mouths. May brought thunderheads as bold as courthouse pillars. One cracked open above Archer's main street while Henry traded seed. The torrent stranded him under Tuttle's awning with Hatchet Bee foreman Earl Jessup, the same man who'd spread theft talk. Lightning hit the feed shed, fire roared, townsfolk scrambled pails. Henry and Jessup hauled water side by side until flame died hissing. When the roof finally collapsed safe inward, Jessup panted, stared through steam. "Reckon I was wrong about your lady," he muttered. Ranger honesty, scorched clean by heat. Henry just nodded, rain sluicing ash from his hat brim. 2 nights later, Nora woke screaming, coal gas dreams clawing out of sleep. Henry found her crouched by the stove, palms over ears. He knelt, whispered rivers and lupines until her gaze found his. She shook, then spoke a name he'd never heard. Silas, her brother, the one the mine took. Words flooded. 9 years old, both of them beneath hardwood rafters when earth shook. Father's lantern shattered, gas howled. Silas suffocated before rescue. Nora carried his song in her ears so the dark would never be silent again. Henry listened, chest heavy but steady, the way barn beams carry snow. He poured a tin of Ella's lavender water, dabbed her temples. "Your brother's tune kept you alive," he said. "Now it can rest." He guided her to the rocker, set the harmonica in her lap. She played a low, stumbling chord, then let the instrument fall quiet. Outside, cicadas drummed, a different soundtrack, one belonging to the living. June grasses shot hip-high, cattle fat and glossy. On the first hot Saturday, the town hosted its summer social, music, pie judging, a quilt raffle to rebuild the burnt feed shed. Nora sewed 3 squares for the raffle top, 1 embroidered cloud, 1 small lupine, 1 tiny forget-me-not spoon stitched in silver thread. When the finished quilt unfurled from the church steps, even the gossip-minded gasped. Nora hovered at edge of the dance square, fingers twisting skirt hem. Henry offered his hand. "1 twirl won't break the moon." Fiddle launched a slow reel. They moved. Awkward at first, then sure. Boots scuffed dust, lanterns swung overhead, and somewhere between verse and chorus, Nora laughed. A clear, ringing note that needed no grave to echo. Jessup cut in with a sheepish grin. Mrs. Tuttle pulled Henry into a two-step. By the time the last chord faded, Nora's hair clung in damp curls and Henry's cheeks hurt from smiling he'd forgotten he owned. When prizes were drawn, the quilt went to the youngest Tuttle girl. She wrapped it round her shoulders, declared it magic against nightmares. Nora's eyes shone, not with pride, but relief, as though a weight had found the right hook to hang upon. Home under starlight, wagon creaked lullabies. At the ridge, Henry halted. Together they climbed to Ella's stone, lantern cup between them. Henry cleared his throat, spoke into the warm dark. "Ella, this is Nora. She's teaching the potatoes hymns." Nora pressed her palm to the marble. "And Ella's teaching me quiet." Wind slipped through grass like a satisfied sigh. They left a jar of peach pits, future orchards instead of flowers. On the walk back, Nora tangled her fingers with Henry's. No promise spoken, only the steady cadence of two sets of footsteps matching across ground that no longer belonged to sorrow alone. The next morning thunderheads loomed again, but these carried rain without flame. Potatoes needed it. Cattle welcomed mud. Henry brewed an extra pot of coffee, set 2 cups on the porch. Nora joined him, handing over a single folded page. Another story, words clean, ink sure. When a spoon bends light, it also catches it. He tucked the page into his pocket. Far down the lane, a Tuttle wagon rattled toward them. Mrs. Tuttle herself, quilt draped across her lap. She waved, no judgment in her smile. Henry poured a 3rd cup, ready. Nora whispered, "Maybe broken doesn't mean dangerous at all." Henry answered, "Maybe broken just means open." And when the first drops fell, they stayed on the porch, letting rain blur all the old lines between crazy and kind, grief and growth, stranger and home. Dust from the fair clung to town for days, but by July's tail the first asters winked violet along the ditch banks, reminding folks that seasons don't ask permission to turn. At Henry's place, potatoes Nora had blessed with lullabies pushed white blooms above dark vines. Bees hummed like muted fiddles. One evening, Sheriff Lantry rode out with the mail pouch. He dismounted slow, brim tipping to Nora, as if she'd always stood on that porch. "Letter for you," he said, offering an envelope thick with unfamiliar postage. Nora's name, Miss Nora Tate, sprawled in a hand she hadn't seen since coal dust blinded a mountain town. She excused herself, opened it behind the barn. Henry hammered gate hinges, pretending not to watch. Minutes later she returned, face pale but eyes alight. "A cousin in Missouri," she whispered, "found Silas's old violin. Wants to send it here." She held the letter like a fragile chick. "Says Silas would be glad the wood can breathe again." Henry nodded, throat tight. Storm clouds rolled heavy in mid-August, blacker than the ones that brought spring rain. These carried dry lightning. Forks exploded cedar, set grass fires that sprinted across the flats. Hatchet bee hands rode north, flames at their heels. Henry hitched the water wagon. Nora forked blankets into barrels, soaking them. They joined the bucket line, passing scorched canvas, already cooling to steam. When the wind finally dropped, half the prairie smoldered charcoal. But the fire had spared the ridge cemetery. Lightning split the sky inches from Ella's stone, then leapt away. Nora knelt there after the last ember died, laying her palm on unburned grass, as if thanking dirt for its stubbornness. Smoke days blurred into harvest weeks. Henry cut hay. Nora raked windrows, hair tied with Mrs. Tuttle's blue thread. At night they shelled beans on the porch, lightning still staining their dreams. One dusk, Mercy arrived with a basket of early apples and news. A railroad agent had posted notices. Survey stakes to run a spur straight through Archer's Crossing, cemetery ground included. Gray settled over Henry's face deeper than ash. Nora read the notice. Relocation of graves, compensation offered. She remembered rocks thrown beneath trestles, names erased for progress. "Ella shouldn't ride a rail car," she said. Henry's hands knotted on the porch step. Town hall filled chin deep next night. Farmers, ranch hands, hatchet bee foreman Jessup. Even the preacher. The railroad man, crisp suit, shiny boots, spoke parcels and profits. Sheriff Lantry cleared his throat, called for objections. Silence thickened until Nora rose from the back row, braid coiled like rope. She unfolded one coal company scrap, smoothed it flat, and read aloud her story of miners whose names were lost because graves were moved for progress. Her voice didn't shake. A town that forgets its dead forgets its living next. Murmurs rippled. Mrs. Tuttle stood, quilt draped over her arm like a flag. My mother rests on that ridge. Jessup added, we just fought fire to save dirt, not to sell it. Mercy nodded, orchard braids silver in lantern light. Vote went against the spur. Railroad man left with dust on his boots, promise of legal battles. But the town's line had been scratched deep. That night Nora returned the story scrap to Henry, edges singed by lantern smoke but words whole. September cooled the valley. One crisp morning, Silas's violin arrived. Wood honey dark, strings loose from travel. Nora tightened pegs, raised bow. First note wavered like a colt on new legs, then steadied. Henry closed his eyes, hearing something between grief and sunrise. They carried the violin to the ridge, played for Ella, simple hymn, wind for choir. When the last note faded, Henry spoke to the stone. Not shy now. Found music again. He lifted Nora's hand, placed it atop the marble. Ella, meet the woman who brought it back. Nora tucked a fresh lupine beside Henry's wooden carving, bloom and cedar side by side, neither outshining the other. Harvest moon fattened pumpkins. First frost silvered porch rails. Henry cleared the dinner dishes, heart thumping like it did the day he first asked Ella to dance. He fetched a small pouch from the mantel, knelt awkward in the doorway. Inside lay a simple bronze band, once meant for a son who never took breath. Nora Tate, he said, voice gravel thick. This is all I own that's round enough to circle a promise. Will you stay the winters with me? Tears welled but didn't fall. Nora pressed the spoon with forget-me-nots into his palm, bent it until the handle formed a loop, slipped it over his finger. Yes, Henry Clove, and we'll let the dead listen, but the living will sing. Outside the wind changed, carrying the smell of snow far off. Inside, a spoon ring and a bronze band caught lamplight, two imperfect circles holding a vow that left no room for loneliness. First snow arrived on their wedding morning, drifting soft as quilts over the porch rail. Sheriff Lantry stood under the walnut, Bible in one mitten, surprise on his breathless laugh. He'd never married folks beside a cradle full of cloth dolls. Mercy, Mrs. Tuttle, Jessup, the preacher, and every Tuttle child formed a tidy half-moon. Viola strings hummed, a tune June had found in Silas's journal, practiced until fingertips blistered. Nora faced Henry, coat fastened with blue thread stitched into a heart. No rings? Lantry teased. Henry lifted his hand. Spoon silver glinted. Nora raised hers. Bronze band warmed by pulse. Lantry's voice flowed steady as creek ice. By promise and witness, I join you. He glanced at sky. And by whatever cedar wind speaks above us. Cheers startled the mare in the corral. Ruth quieted her. Shotgun nowhere in sight. Her guard duty traded today for flower duty. She flung a fistful of dried lupine seeds overhead. They snowed violet against white. Ida's harmonica followed with a bright trill. This time the note sounded like birth, not warning. After stew and apple bread, guests left tracks back to town. Dusk settled blue. Henry led Nora up the ridge one last time before winter locked the trail. They carried the cradle, empty save for quilts smelling of lavender, and set it near Ella's stone. Henry knelt, brushed snow from the name. Thank you for the years you gave, he whispered. We'll fill the rest with music. Nora laid Silas's violin case by the cradle, lifted the lid. Cold wood gleamed, alive despite the chill. She drew the bow once, note hovered, then let silence hold it. Together they turned downhill, leaving the cradle and the violin under the walnut as a shrine to beginnings, not endings. Winter closed its fist. Drifts walled the porch, smoke stacked dark in the still air. Nights Henry read seed catalogs. Nora stitched story scraps into a quilt of words. Miners, rivers, spoons, clouds. June practiced scales beside the stove. Ruth rode fence at dawn, coat dusted with frost crystals. Ida fashioned snow angels, then laughed at the sky. January mail coach brought sealed documents. County court deeded the ridge as Clove Memorial Ground, untouchable by rail. Nora framed the paper, hung it over the hearth. Living and dead protected, she murmured. Henry squeezed her shoulder. Family land. One calm evening, baby goat Bleats drifted from the barn. The nanny had kidded early. Two small bodies, legs no thicker than fiddlebows. Henry carried the weaker to the house, laid it in the cradle by the fire. Nora wrapped it in the lavender quilt. Silas's violin kept vigil from the stand nearby, strings glowing ember red. The kid survived, nibbled finger and bleated. They named her Daisy, first blossom of a spring not yet born. March thaw returned, creek chuckling under ice. The cemetery ridge shone green. Henry and Nora climbed with Daisy dancing behind. Lupine's Nora had planted the first summer thrust new leaves through loam. Henry set a cedar stake beside Ella's stone. This hill listens. Nora smiled. Words no longer needed granite to echo. They stood, fingers interlaced, watching snow retreat into shadowed gullies. Far below, Archer's Crossing rang hammers on new siding for a depot built south of town. Rails routed away from graves by a vote that refused to forget. The whistle in the distance sounded friendly now, like someone announcing they'd pass by without trespass. Nora felt Henry's heartbeat under her glove, steady as thaw water. She whispered to the air, "Crazy is another word for unheard." Wind raced the ridge, but instead of stealing the phrase, it carried it outward, down into the town that had learned her name. They turned homeward, two sets of tracks pressing side by side in soft mud, Daisy's print skipping between. The spoon ring flashed, the bronze band caught morning flare, and behind them the walnuts stretched first buds toward a sky limitless enough for all their stories.